Hey guys, we're an interesting video on Wild Rift. So we're back with another episode 7 of Wild Rift Fundamentals. So today we're going to be covering a roles guide. So now, obviously, I've already mentioned in my video on how to improve and climb that you should be picking only one primary role and one secondary role. So the best way to, of course, climb and get better at the game is to just focus on one role. So in this video, I'm going to talk about each of the 5 roles. And of course, this is more targeted at beginners. So if you are already a veteran player of the game, this video probably isn't going to help you all too much. But this is more for people who want to choose a role to main in the game. So I'm going to discuss the 5 roles, and then after we discuss the 5 roles, we're going to discuss which roles are the best to climb. Now, we're going to get into that later, but not necessarily the best roles to climb are the roles that you should start out with. So anyways, let's quickly jump to the actual topic and begin with the Baron lane. Alright, so the Baron lane is generally a 1v1 lane, and it is honestly, in my opinion, the lane with the most diversity in terms of what kind of champion you can pick. Because in this role, you can technically pick like pretty much any type of champion aside from maybe support champions, but actually there is even like a strategy in League PC like the Smite Janna top or having just like supports top, Lulu top. It could be a strategy as well. So technically speaking, you could pick any single champion in this role. You have AP tops like Kennen, you have bruiser tops like Garen and Darius, tank top like Malphite, like Mundo. Then you can also pick something like AD carry top like Vayne or Lucian top lane. So technically speaking, you can pick like anything top, Assassin top, Rengar top, that kind of thing. So basically, in my opinion, is the role with the most diversity in terms of the type of champions you can pick. But basically, top lane, there is only one main aspect of top lane, which is pretty much, or rather I should say the Baron lane in Wild Rift, which is pretty much the 1v1 lane matchup. So pretty much your pick is kind of going to be determined by if you can see your enemies pick first and you might want to counter pick, or pretty much is a very, very mechanical and matchup dependent role. So the two most important things in top lane is the matchup. Like for example, Riven versus Renekton, we all know who's gonna win that matchup. Specific matchups, they get counter-picked, countered, that kind of things. The other thing is your mechanics, of course. So something like Fiora, Camille, very mechanically intensive champions. Now, even if you play a very, very mechanically simple champion like a Malphite, you still need the mechanics for when your opponent wants to go all in on you, you have to be able to outplay them. For example, flash a important skill shot on a Malphite. So pretty much you're still gonna need important mechanics. And at top and ADC are probably the two roles that you need the best mechanics. I would say top is very, very mechanically intensive. So that's pretty much top lane. It's pretty much a kind of 1v1 show. So it's pretty good for you to go top lane or main top lane as a role or Baron lane if you like 1v1s, like you think you're mechanically good or you can be mechanically good and you can just pretty much just beat out your opponent 1v1. Now we're going to discuss the jungle. So the jungle is pretty much the most unique role out of all the 5 roles because you don't actually really belong to a lane. So you have a couple of main things that you do. The first thing that you do is obviously you farm the jungle itself, you farm the buffs, you farm the camps. So you take all the farm, that are in between the lanes. You don't belong to any lane. So your second main job is of course to gank lanes and to get your lanes ahead. So obviously what that means is you pretty much show up to a lane and try to help your laners or yourself secure a kill with a numbers advantage. And finally, the most important job of a jungler is to show up at objective fights like the Dragon or like the Baron, and pretty much they have the Smite, which it does of course deal a large amount of true damage. Now in general, Smite is gonna do the most amount of damage to a monster. Now of course there are exceptions like Nunu's Consume, Jin's Force Shot in the late game. There are some things that can do more damage than Smite to a monster, but as a general rule of thumb, Smite does in most situations, in most games, the most damage you can possibly do to a monster. So it's your job as a jungler to secure the objective for your team when your team is doing the objective, or maybe if the enemy team is doing it, it's your job to steal the objective if the situation permits. So pretty much that's the job of the jungler. Now, we're gonna move on to the mid lane. So now the mid lane is very similar to the top lane, where it is kind of a 1v1, but there is a very, very important difference about the mid lane and the top lane. Now, firstly, it's the length of the lane. The mid lane is the shortest lane in the game, whereas the top lane is the longest lane in the game. Same as the support and ADC lane, but support and ADC is not a 1v1. So in the mid lane, it is the shortest lane, which also means that the proximity to towers are closer, which also means it is technically harder to get solo kills because your enemy can get to their tower more easily compared to a long lane, where if they make a grave mistake in terms of where they are in the lane, they find it very hard to run back. But this one, you can get to the tower a little bit more easily. Of course, that's not to say that solo kills are impossible in mid lane. Of course, they do happen a lot, but it is a lot less 1v1 than top lane, because as the mid laner, you have a very key role and responsibility that top lane does not have, or it's more important to have in mid lane, which is rotations. So basically, as the mid laner, you're literally at the center of the map, at least for the first couple of minutes of the game before the mid lane tower falls or anything else happens on the map. So it is your job to rotate to other lanes to either, number one, you gank other lanes like the jungler. So you can even show up with your jungler, making it, let's say, a 3v1 with your jungler and your mid laner, and of course your, let's say, your top laner versus the enemy top laner. So that's your first job: rotate and gank the other lanes of the enemy team. Secondly is to actually rotate to different positions on the map depending on what's happening, because you are the easiest position to rotate because you're in the middle of the map. For example, there is a scuttle fight happening at the top side jungle. Now, of course, assuming that your top laner is at top and the map is not inverted, your top laner should also be rotating. So technically speaking, generally at the highest levels of play, when like there's a scuttle fight, let's say everybody rotates. Eventually, a scuttle fight could become a 3v3 or a 4v4, something like that, where the top laner and mid laner both shows up. But generally, if you were to ask me, I think it's more important for the mid laner to show up than for like the ADC or the top laner to show up. Of course, it is still very important, but mid lane is a kind of rotation based role, and you should always be ready to rotate, and also, of course, mid lane requires a lot of map awareness as well because of the nature of the role. Alright, so now we're gonna talk about ADC as a role, or the dragon lane, or the duo lane, or whatever it's called in WoW. Some people call it the dragon lane, sometimes it's called duo, but anyway, so we're gonna talk about ADC. So basically, ADC is pretty much the role where you have the least pick diversity, because pretty much you will almost all the time be picking some form of a marksman. Now, there is exceptions to this, like specific bot lane strategies, for example, the Seraphine Sona strategy, or it could be an APC like Ziggs, for example, or Brand, Vega, or Rihanna. Could be an APC, but generally, in like 95% of games, you will be picking a traditional ADC, a traditional marksman. So this role pretty much, it is of course my main role, and majority of videos I do on my channel is of course based on ADC, which is of course my main role. But pretty much the main thing an ADC is pretty much you're going to be very, very weak in the early game, but you are mainly focused on auto attacks in general. So generally, the longer the game gets, the stronger you're going to become, because the more items you get, and therefore the stronger your auto attacks, and you basically become strong exponentially, where like in the late game when you have like 4 or 5 items, you're going to hurt like a truck. But in the early game, your attacks, all they do is like tickle the enemy tank, and it doesn't even really do anything. So ADC is really good for people who are okay with being very, very weak in the early game, but eventually become very strong. Alright, so the thing about ADC, the most important part of being an ADC likely is your positioning. So generally, as an ADC, you should always be in the backline of your team, behind your bruisers, behind your fighters, behind your tanks, and you should always just be in the backline being protected, because technically speaking, you are your team's main AD damage output in the vast majority of games. So you have to stay safe and not die, because if you die, there goes your team's DPS, and your team is a lot more likely to lose the fight without you than with you. So of course, that's about the most important thing for ADC's positioning, which is why ADC is also very mechanically intensive role. Like top lane it's about the 1v1s, and ADC is just about the positionings to not get caught out. You have to be in a position where you can actually do damage, but at the same time not put yourself at too much risk. So it's a constant balancing act of being safe but being able to do damage at the same time. Alright, so finally we're going to talk about supports, and honestly I think support is a very important role that a lot of people kind of like look down upon, or is not really appreciated as much as it should be. So support, basically at the start of the game, you generally go with your ADC to the bot lane, and you kind of babysit your ADC, because as we just discussed, ADCs are very very weak in the early game, so they kind of need a support to kind of facilitate them getting kills, or just facilitate them not dying. But supports have a way more important role than that. Supports generally, there are two types of supports in general, tank engage supports and enchanter supports. So enchanters just buff up their allies, whereas tank engage supports, generally, of course, they are tanky, and they generally will provide the engage for their team, where they, of course, will initiate for the team. So supports have way more roles than that. Like, aside from babysitting your ADC, a very important part about support is, roaming to mid lane, even roaming to top lane and getting your other lanes a hit, almost like a pseudo second jungle. But support just a very very important role, and if support is played well, can get your team, your entire team, not just your ADC, your entire team a hit very very easily. Alright, so now let me briefly discuss all of the roles. Some roles we discuss more than others, but I'm not going to tell you guys which roles I think are the best for carrying and ranking up. Then we're going to talk briefly about which roles I recommend for beginners. Alright, so first up, I think the best role to climb and to carry is no doubt the jungle role, because the jungle role has the biggest impact on the map. You're always unseen, you can influence any lane that you want, get your laners a hit, and if you're a good jungler, you will get your whole team a hit. So it's pretty much very simple. If you're a good jungler, you generally will win more than you lose, because jungle is the most impactful role in the game. However, jungle is also a very very difficult role to play, because you have to understand lane matchups, you have to understand when you can and cannot go for scuttles, for objectives, even for a buff, what kind of pathing you should take, and you have to adapt a lot of things on the fly. Sometimes things don't go according to plan, something happens. So jungle is the hardest role to play, but it's pretty much the best role. Then we have mid. Mid is also for a very similar reason, which is that you can move to other parts of the map very easily, influence the map a lot. So generally, the higher map impact you have, the better the role is. And yeah, so that's kind of why mid is second. Now third might surprise some of you. I actually leaked it out already. It is support. So support, in my opinion, is in third place. I do think that support is very very important. Of course, if you play supports very well, especially tank engage, you can generally get your team a hit if you're a good support. And of course, you will be a little bit thankless. People may not really see it, but you know that you are the one that's getting your team a hit. Like with your giant Alistar engage or your giant Leona engage in mid to get your mid laner a kill, and then doing it again to get them snowballing, that kind of thing. You generally won't be seen as the carry. You almost will never be seen as the carry unless maybe you play Senna or something. But you have a very important role. Then on number 4, the second worst role to carry is actually top, because in top you generally have very low map impact, because you're generally in a 1v1 majority of the time. Some top laners don't really rotate to objective fights anyways, so you have quite a low map impact. But if you are really that good 1v1, you can still get yourself a hit through lane, and then you can proceed on to carry your team. And that leaves the worst role of the game being my own role, which is ADC. Now, the reason why I think ADC is the worst role to climb, worst role to kind of climb in solo queue is pretty much because you have the least agency in the game. Now, pretty much, in case you guys didn't realize, the bot lane is mostly determined by how good your support is, because as an ADC at the early levels, you're pretty much useless, and same goes for any ADC. So pretty much bot lane is kind of determined by which support player is better. Of course, the ADC does contribute, like, spells and auto attacks, etc. But in the early game, really, you can't do anything much. And of course, in the late game, you are the star of the show. But the issue is that, this game is so early game focused, and it is such a snowbally type of game that if, the rest of your team is trash or something like that, no matter how good of an ADC player you are, there literally is nothing you can do about the situation because you just have no agency in the early game. Maybe a slight exception to this might be Draven, but Draven is just an exception. The ADC role in general is, in my opinion, the worst role. So now, we're going to briefly discuss what I think the best role is for beginners. Now, I'm going to just put it out there, I think it is mid. Now, as we discussed ADC and top, very low map, impact not really worth it. Jungle, I personally feel is too hard, way too difficult to learn as your first role. I started League PC as a jungler, and I really think it made my life very difficult because learning jungle as your first role, you just need too much knowledge of the game to play jungle effectively. So jungle as your first role is never a good idea. So it's basically between mid and support, and obviously between mid and support, mid is a very good option because of your high impact. You learn a lot of important things like laning, rotations, map awareness, that kind of thing. But as support, you can also learn about map awareness, about laning, but you have, of course, a little bit more of a facilitative playstyle, and a lot of people like starting off with support because even though I say it's a very high impact role, which it is, generally because people don't really notice what your support is doing a lot of the time, unless the support is KSing non-stop, people will notice that. But generally when supports like screw up big time, people notice it a lot less than an ADC or a mid screwing up. Is one aspect of it, and another aspect of it is some people just don't feel that supports screwing up matters as much to their team. So sometimes they don't want to sabotage their team, so they pick support. But I don't think that's true. I think support is very, very important to the team. But simply just mid or support is pretty much just the best role to start off the game with. So with that, we come to the end of our discussion on roles. Hopefully this video helps somebody choose their starting role in the game. So, thank you guys so much for watching the video, and goodbye.
Victory!